Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Martin Luther King Jr. came to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 on a mission to a place he called the most segregated city in the United States.
To dramatize this blatant injustice and to demand that the federal government not put a cent in this city unless it decides to face the realities of desegregation.
In the nonviolent demonstrations that followed, King and hundreds of protesters were arrested. They were pressing the city to eliminate laws that sought to keep blacks and whites separated in schools, restaurants, and many other public places. King and his followers were met with fierce resistance from the police. Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, backed by the majority of white residents, was determined to stop the demonstrations. Without enough volunteers to continue the protests, King and other leaders enlisted hundreds of young school children to keep the marches going and fill up the jails. The young African-American student protesters would gather here on the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church and hear inspirational speeches from civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They would then file from the church and walk across the street to a park where they were determined to demonstrate peacefully for equal rights. Then on the second day of the student demonstrations, things turned violent. Police turned high-pressure fire hoses on the young people and set attack dogs on them. Birmingham civil rights leader Reverend Calvin Woods was there.
There had been some dog biting, some beating, some killing. Many people were beaten and spit on and put in jail, lost jobs. But those were minor things compared to what we felt we had to do.
Well, hear that freedom train a-coming.
Spending a summer in Mississippi taught me a lot about this country. My high school social studies teacher taught me that we all have rights. Mississippi summer taught me that we didn't all have rights.
They'll be coming by the thousand.
When we began to go to Mississippi, the black people we met there were not interested in lunch counters. They weren't interested in sitting in the front of the bus. There were no lunch counters. There were no buses. They wanted to vote.
In 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, King would launch waves of protests in the hope that images of aggressive police action might arouse the conscience of the nation and its president. Billy Graham called for restraint, saying King should put the brakes on. When King himself was arrested for marching without a permit, white religious leaders in Birmingham denounced him.
Fellow men of God are calling for him to back away. He's creating more problems. He's disturbing the peace. He is bringing woes to the South. They saw that as ungodly. And Martin Luther King was appalled.
So he started writing this letter from the Birmingham jail. He wrote it around the margins of the New York Times. And when he ran out of space, he wrote on toilet tissue.
The letter itself is a response to the challenge of white ministers in Birmingham who had said, you know, why are you coming? Why are you causing trouble in our city? So he has to respond to that because they're challenging him as a Christian minister and saying that what you're doing doesn't seem very Christian to me.
In his letter, later published in the Atlantic Monthly, King said he was preaching the gospel of freedom and challenged the complacency of his fellow ministers.
He goes on to question the good faith of the religious leaders in the churches who were so critical of his movement. He says, I drive by their churches with their perfectly manicured front lawns, and I ask myself, who is their God?
How can someone who professes to worship a God and a Savior, who saw all people as being equal, who created all people equal, a Christ who died for all people, how could these servants of that God and of that Christ do anything other than join in the fight for civil rights?
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.